And we are live. This is Dark Journalist, and it's great to have everyone here. It's a very special broadcast that we're going to have today on Howard Hughes and Howard Hughes' Secret Space Network and Permindex, and how this kind of relates to everything that we've been talking about in the X series. Of course, we're joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And, you know, it's fascinating. I really have been thinking about Howard Hughes a lot as I've been doing this research because he comes up over and over again. And he is really one of these main characters that people just don't quite understand because he was cloaked behind that huge wall of secrecy over there in Nevada. But what we're going to find out is that he spent the majority of his time here in Boston, actually. And that is going to be something I think that everyone's going to find a little bit strange, and that his final years were spent in the Bahamas. And this whole thing about Nevada and Las Vegas, frankly, the man was scared to death of nuclear energy and nuclear radiation. So he didn't spend a whole heck of a lot of time in Nevada, as it turns out. One of the things I want to do as we get into this episode also is really identify the segment that we're in. You know, very often with these shows, we'll stretch all the way in this deep state history going back to the mystery schools. And we will also come and bring that all together right up to the Trump era and where we are now. But there's this key period that we lock in, and it's right when the UFO secrecy aspect kicked in around the UFO file. And that is right after World War II. And it brings us into the Star Wars period, and right in between this kind of 1940, about 45 to 88. This is a very important lock window, because when you get outside of that, all these things have been treated predetermined. So that when you get into areas like the Clinton era, or if you get into even the Bush era, you're already following a predetermined script. All the rules have been written 50 years earlier. So we have to go back and grab those kind of important benchmarks along the way. This is the crucial thing that we can do with this. But as many incredible researchers have looked at this for years and try to figure out exactly what was going on. Well, in doing this research, of course, we came across the X Steganography. And the X Steganography is something that really forms the foundation of the X series that we're doing, because what it basically says is that we have a symbol, a reminder in all of these different programs that go black of how they move the secrecy of the UFO file and the secrecy of the kind of mystery school battles, this kind of extra territorial warfare that goes on. And it doesn't have anything to do with, you know, just ordinary politics or ordinary cover-ups. This is a much deeper level when we get to the X part. Although the ordinary stuff that we've looked into over the years and the regular cover-ups, when people have said, hey, there's a UFO cover-up, or there's a cover-up of the assassinations and political assassinations since the JFK assassination. Those things are real and true, but we can put a foundation together in a much more coherent way, in a much more coherent fashion, because we now have a guide, and the guide is this X Steganography. And the X is very well researched, so I feel very good putting it out here, because one of the things that we know when we get into this is we don't want too much of a guessing game going on. What we want to do is know from connecting the dots exactly what these people and what these groups were doing. And I think the great mystery and the great problem is a lot of people say, why would they cover it up? You know, and inevitably they'll get back to things like, well, money, you know, they did it for financial reasons. And we'll take that whole tack. But that actually isn't a good enough excuse, in my opinion. There's something much deeper going on, and that's what we're going to get into. Now, before we get into Hughes, we have some amazing images and background on Hughes, which is far different from just this kind of manic freak who, you know, liked to date beautiful women and, you know, was a germaphobe. I mean, that's a whole sideshow, and they love to portray Hughes just with that, because it gets us around all the kind of real hardcore, deep things that he was into. And you're going to find this guy showing up in the strangest places. And I mean, before the evening's over, we're going to understand American history with Howard Hughes and how that affects the globe in a much better fashion. But here he is. And he is there in action, the classic action hero that he billed himself to be. After all, he was a director, let's not forget. But he didn't like basically just living in the screen after he became a director. He wanted to become the incredible aviator that he was portraying in these incredible movies. And really the director thing, I mean, he actually did quite well at almost everything he tried, because when he goes to do the director thing, he actually wins an Oscar. And he has a great love for it, but mostly because he can get surrounded by all this kind of glamour. But what we're going to find out about Hughes is that he was very young, 19 years old, when he inherited so much money, and that this really affected his judgment in a number of ways. And so he was kind of manipulated from the beginning. And very often people like to think about Hughes and they'll say, like, well, you know, he was this kind of smart aleck Texan, or he had this, you know, kind of regular Western way about him or whatever. Well, let's get to the truth of the matter. This is another strange thing, but Hughes' dad actually is alumni of Harvard, okay? And he went through Harvard, then he went to law school, and he was just, you know, the insider man. As a matter of fact, at one point, he was considered for the position of president of the Harvard Club in New York. So this is like somebody whose deep, deep, deep ties go in. And so he had these political ties, and he was looking and working with his company, which was Hughes Tool Company, of developing this kind of super way to drill oil, which was all the rage. And we had this incredible, you know, just amazing. The dot-com explosion was nothing like the oil explosion that was going on. I mean, everybody was going crazy, and we're trying to find oil wells everywhere. So this was really the dot-com of its time. And as it turns out, Hughes' dad did remarkably well. Hughes' dad, again, a very sophisticated family. You know, they kind of portray Hughes as like a good old boy, but his uncle actually was an incredible novelist. His sister, his aunt, so his dad's sister, was an incredible opera singer. You know, this incredibly established family. So when he inherits his dad's business at 18, his dad has an embolism, and he's gone like that, and it's a big shock to him. But he's instantly manipulated by all the people who were handling the company. So right from the very start, somebody saw an opportunity. They said, there's a 19-year-old kid ahead of this company, which is the equivalent of $1 billion company now. So that's what we get on him going in. He was a little bit eccentric at a young age, but it kind of doesn't matter. A lot of people are, and that's the only thing they want to concentrate on. And then later they're like, oh, he's a germaphobe, and, you know, he'd like to talk to people between plate class, and he OCD and all this stuff. But, you know, he had some interesting quirks. There's no doubt about it. But the real story of Hughes are his deep connections and the deep things he was involved with, and the way that he saw the world, and where he was willing to move his money, and how they manipulated his patriotism to get him deeply involved in things like CIA drug running, you know, CIA assassinations, you know, really taking him in his position and manipulating it through very skillful mind control. So we have to look at Hughes in a completely different fashion. So when you see a bio of Hughes, or when you're kind of looking at him, they're like, oh, that wild millionaire, the wild billionaire who really, you know, wanted to be frozen in his own DNA, or whatever it happens to be. He was a lot deeper, and he was right at the very heart of the political situation, and he was intent on denuclearizing the United States. That's a key point. So let's keep that in mind as we go. Now let's get familiar with a few people in his life also. It's another great shot of him as an aviator, really knocking him dead. And, you know, I have to say, as we're looking at the Howard Hughes legacy and the Howard Hughes things, the X Steganography is so deep in the work that he did that it goes back to even before he was born, as far as the Hughes Tool Company. And one of their key offerings was this whole X Select group of oil drills. And it's so fascinating to me that you could kind of brush that off as a coincidence. But by the time we get to Hughes and Hughes Aircraft, and how he's one of the first early space adopters, and he gets really hardcore into that. then we start to understand the X part in his life is very legit, and how he becomes a part of that X program that we find circulating around the UFO file. Before we go any further with Hughes, let's take a look at what we're talking about when we're talking about X. Why are we even bothering looking at X? Well, the X steganography shows up over and over again. When we have projects go black, they reemerge, and they have this X designation. So the naming function of the X does not only subscribe to secrecy of political and technological secrets, it seems to, the further back we go with it, track into mystery schools, religion, and it all seems to go back to this effect that is created by something. And in the modern era with the UFO file, we go through this again and again. We see people coming forward and saying, well, my time stood still, I lost time, I was disoriented, and people, when they check out the area, they say, well, the electronics were out, whatever it is. So there's an effect that surrounds the whole UFO aspect. And as it turns out, this is part of what they're hiding in the UFO file, which is the need for that maximum secrecy is not just, hey, we've got hot technology and it's hotter secret than the atomic bomb, which it is. But the effect itself is so reality distorting that if they don't, they're afraid of it themselves, is the first point. Now, yes, they can take advantage of it, but they're afraid of it. It's out of their control. And so an extra reason for secrecy beyond the greed, because as we've seen, some of the mystery schools have helped keep some of this underground, because they've tried to keep it out of the hands of a lot of these corporate and political masters that we deal with now, who take advantage of things like 5G. Can you imagine if they had what's in the UFO file and really were using it to the maximum? So they certainly have a pretty good piece of it. And I guess that's the bad news. The good news is if we can get a handle on what they're doing with it, and if we can get a handle on what it is, then we'll be able to recognize it a whole lot better. And also that there are groups that seem to be outside of their reach, that is the establishment reach, who are people inside that establishment. And it seems like there are groups outside of that who have their own access to this, maybe not from a government UFO file, but from a deeper tradition of handing it down. Now, just to keep score on this, I've named the effect apotheum, and that's basically, the reality distorter, if you just want to think about it that. It's kind of a quandary for reality. Let's look at a little bit of where the X takes us early on before we get into Hughes. And then I'm going to really drop some big bombs with Hughes tonight, because there's a few things which just haven't been on the record, as you can imagine. So hang on just a second. I'm going to get this ready. And let's take a look at that. Okay, terrific. Now I can see everybody. Olivia, how are we doing over there?
We are doing great.
Olivia is the technical maven of the night right now. So we have to look at these connections early on and take them up to the present moment. So let's take just a quick look. And those of you familiar with the X series have seen this before. That's John Connally in the middle. Donald Trump is over here on this side. And over on the other side is former President Richard Nixon. This close connection between Nixon and Trump is important when we look at this, because when you talk about Richard Nixon, you're talking about Hubert Humphrey. And you're talking about Howard Hughes. These three things are going to link up as we go along here. The X and the role that it plays with Nixon, we've seen extensively in the programs that Nixon was really deep and working with people like Gene Dixon and putting together things like Nixon's Pyramid, which was an incredible anti-ballistic missile station. And it really looks like Stonehenge when you look at it. I mean, the things that Nixon is getting influenced by is just phenomenal. And then we've had whistleblowers come forward that I've spoken to who have real credentials about it. And we had him on this program, Robert Merritt, talking about the Nixon time capsule and its reference to Planet X. Then as I got deeper into the research, I've been looking at X for maybe something like 2.5 years, 3 years of setting this up. But as I was looking at it on this level of tracking a time capsule, we came back and looked at President Eisenhower. And in 1953, Eisenhower set up a 100-year time capsule called Project X. And it was associated with Nixon. They've never really said how, but that wasn't something that came out in some book as a willy-nilly thing. It was in a number of books by people who were in that milieu of like the Council on Foreign Relations. You know, so like Evan Thomas, the former editor for Newsweek, these very traditional people who don't want to deal with any of the important subjects that we're talking about, they were talking about it. And that started to make me wonder, like, I wonder how many of those echelons even know about this. And why are they mentioning it in here? It's kind of fascinating. Or maybe they don't know. Maybe they're curious. But whatever it happened to be, the deeper and deeper we got into it, we started to see that President Johnson also had this X letter that was at his library, which he'd put there in 1973. And he said, guess what? Open this in 50 years after I'm dead. Well, that's 2023. So what are these X letters? What is this X kind of linkage, this X pattern that these presidents are putting away? And what we've done here is ascertain that they're all related in some way to the UFO file. And that is, when this information comes out, they want to expose the role of these presidents do. They want to explain the role that they had in bringing it out. And when you look at it from that perspective, then we start to get a real handle on what it is. Let's look at President Johnson's X letter. And what it says is, the X envelope, eyes only, Mr. Harry Middleton, Director, LBJ Library, to be opened 50 years from June 1973. So that would bring us to about 5 years from now. As we go deeper into this end of the pond, we find this letter, which is a letter from Donald Trump, from Richard Nixon to Donald Trump. And what it's telling him is, 1987, I think that you should run for president. And we predict you'll win, me and Pat, okay? Now, this is very interesting because we've gone into the history around Gene Dixon, who makes predictions for the Nixons, and he is sort of giving him this opening. And then after this, they start doing fundraisers together. Nixon moves to New York to be close to Trump. They have a much tighter loop, a much tighter relationship. What else can we discover in this particular period? John Trump, of course, Trump's uncle, one of the top scientists in the country, who was sent out to look at Nikola Tesla's papers as soon as he died. This is very important because the people in those programs, like the FBI, and who are really deep in these agencies, who are looking for the things that Tesla had, they needed somebody that they could trust, but who also was a crackerjack. And Trump was just the man that they wanted. Now, we've exposed in these shows that Trump was part of the Rad Lab, and that his the man who was his protege was Vannevar Bush. So Vannevar Bush being in charge of the UFO file for so many years, and John Trump being close to that, and then them sending in Trump to examine the Tesla papers because they were looking for, according to Trump, and that's a quote, they were looking for something that could take down flying objects at a distance. So if I'm in Hawaii and I want to take down a flying object that's over Scandinavia, I can do it. This is whatever that architecture was. That's what they were looking for. That was the technological hint that they were giving. So that's what he was looking for. Whether or not he found it's another question. But of course, when Olivia and I went over to get John Trump's papers, because of course MIT is pretty close by, what did we run into? John Trump's papers were in Box X. There's no denying it. That's where they were. Now, what's fascinating about all that is the papers themselves aren't so revealing. I mean, we'll see by the time we get to the end of them. But whatever was in there, that check mark, that designator, they needed to have that X on there because he's deep in the rad lab, and they are moving that UFO file information around using the X, as we've demonstrated here over and over again. So we're deep into why they're using the X and how it comes up, and why, when we get into people like Howard Hughes, you know, why is there a big X UFO connection with Howard Hughes? You know, these are the questions that we need to ask when we go into this. And this is where we're going to get some answers tonight. But we can see, and, you know, I use certain examples from the previous shows because we're into episode 14 of this series. And we've covered things like the Varian brothers and the connection to Theosophy, Vice President Henry Wallace and President X, and the Trump-Tesla connection. So we're getting an entire vista now as we get into this episode. So this portion, this aspect is crucial, because when you get into Hughes, you're getting into the Nixon period. You're getting into the JFK period. You're getting into the RFK assassination period. And then you're getting into the CIA and the incredible drug explosion period. And then that takes us into the whole Star Wars period. All along the way, we're running into the people that we're dealing with now, like the Trumps. So these things, these threads are connected, and we can look at them in connections over the past century, for example. But the truth is, we found connections that go all the way back thousands of years. So whatever it is these groups are handing along with each other, it is not, let's say, you know, it's not a curiosity. It's more like a keepsake. It's something that they understand that they need to keep a handle on. And the deeper we go into those secret societies and mystery schools, we start to understand this caused a lot of problems for the greater whole of humanity back in the day, with things like the destruction of Atlantis and so on. That's where those legends come from. So this is no question the same thing that we're talking about when we get to the UFO file secrecy. That's what has to be understood. When they're doing X designations, they're moving around something and hiding it. But it's not just, I mean, it'd be interesting enough just to be around one particular program, so we could track a program. But we're actually tracking a secondary reality when we're talking about this. And that's kind of the interesting contrast, and maybe the curveball with the X episodes, because we have to be on board with a typical investigation, and then we have to use some other aspect in order to ascertain and really get at the meat of this. Okay, so Olivia, do I have the Age book? Age of Secrecy?
Right over here.
Thank you. I didn't bring it. Hey, look.
There you go.
Fabulous.
Hi,
Gracias, senorita. There you go. I do. I'm going to read your poem now. I think that there's maybe something very crucial in the work of John Mayer. And one of the things I want to say is that maybe he's somebody that, you know, we really have to kind of consider. Mayer was an assistant for over a decade to Hughes, and he's a very accomplished fellow in his own right. He's done, he had a run for the Senate in New Mexico. He is a political consultant. He's really worked in those circles and negotiated for the Hughes empire. And eventually, with his knowledge and the things that he knew about the Hughes empire, the U.S. government chased him out, basically. And he found himself in countries far-flung in Asia, and now he resides in Canada. And it's a really, really interesting set of circumstances around him. But he did a very brave thing. About in 2015, he came out with this book, which I can tell you is not widely publicized. It's called Age of Secrets. And the subtitle is The Conspiracy That Toppled Richard Nixon and the Hidden Death of Howard Hughes. And I can tell you that it lives up to its title. And as far as Mayer himself, his background is unquestionable. That is, there's documentation, there's photographs. He was Hughes' aide. One of the important things that came through in his work was, well, twofold. One, I think that's very interesting to note, that Hughes had a great interest in paranormal aspects and on a regular basis consulted with Peter Hurkos, who was a famous psychic of the period. Hurkos is this guy who was a Dutch clairvoyant who fell off a ladder. He was actually painting a house, and as a result of getting hit, woke up with incredible psychic abilities, and they called him in on all these high-profile cases, like the Boston Strangler and things of this nature. So he had an incredible background, and I do feel that maybe, working with Hughes was getting at certain information. So before we dive into all the revelations about Maheu, let's take a look at a few other very compelling connections around our friend Howard Hughes. This individual is somebody we're going to want to really track. His name is Robert Maheu. He's a retired FBI guy, deep in with the CIA, and he became the other tight aide to Howard Hughes. Eventually, Hughes would break with him, and there's a lot of different kind of scenarios as to why that happened. But it's going to become very important as we go along here. One of the things I want to mention also is that what we get at when we're looking deep into Hughes is we get into this guy, George Van Tassel. A lot of the people who are familiar with the UFO field will know Van Tassel because he was so deep in the kind of UFO wave of the 50s. And, they have this crazy conference every year, a Contact in the Desert, and they always pump up that, hey, nearby is Giant Rock and the Integratron. And the Integratron here is something that was designed by Van Tassel. Van Tassel's story is pretty easy. He was a aerospace engineer for Hughes. And in fact, what's not often mentioned, and I can't for the life of me understand why, is that he was actually Hughes' personal flight inspector. So that's a tight relationship. And what he did was he set up his own airport called Giant Rock Airport, which was like, where private planes would take off. And Hughes would go there all the time. They were incredibly close. Well, what's odd about this picture? Our friend, Van Tassel, is deep in the UFO file. He's coming out and saying, well, they had me on their craft. They showed me their advanced stuff. Hey, I'm an engineer. I know better, regardless of how crazy it sounds. They taught me how to build this Integratron. And by the way, eventually it's going to reverse the aging process. They have ships and colonies all over the place and so on. This is Howard Hughes' personal flight inspector. So starting to understand the UFO file now with Hughes, it's pretty tight, wrapped in pretty close. The Integratron itself was built with, guess whose money? It was built with Howard Hughes' money. That might give us a little hint about what's coming here. So let's kind of wrap our brains around this. I'm going to repeat these facts. Hughes' personal flight inspector and close friend was George Van Tassel. Van Tassel was this aerospace engineer that worked for Hughes and Lockheed, by the way, who was, found himself in these incredible circumstances, and I'm going to relay from his book here, of being in the situation of having what we would call an ET contact, abductee experience. They take him aboard their ship. They show him this incredible technology. They tell him, you have to stop all of these nuclear tests that are going on. And then we find out Howard Hughes is adamant against nuclear tests. Well, I wonder why. He's obviously taking Van Tassel's message to heart. Van Tassel's funded in his little airport by Hughes, and he builds the Integratron, which the ETs tell him to build, with the money from Hughes. Okay, now we have all those details locked in. Let's go a little bit further. What he says is that I need to take the Tesla coil technology in order to perfect the machine that they helped me to build. And in fact, he spends years developing this. And he goes through ups and downs and all the rest of it. But oddly enough, very much like John Keeley, upon his death, although the Integratron was restored eventually by these sisters who bought it and did a great job bringing it back to life, all of his technology disappears, a la John Keeley. Everything that he was working on of this Tesla variety to make the Integratron come to life, which he said ETs had given him the instructions to build. This is a very unusual situation for Hughes to be involved with. For to take him as just the swashbuckling kind of cowboy billionaire, who walked into it. Something very different's going on here. In my opinion, it's Hughes' background through Harvard, that is his dad's background at Harvard. And this is kind of fascinating because, when we really think about those connections and we're really drawing into what was going on here, a lot of that secrecy and the understanding around the X aspects comes in through Harvard, as we've seen when Henry Kissinger headed up this 1950s thing that Bill Steinman talked about, which was the whole, Progress for America report, and that had a UFO aspect, but they always kept that part hidden, and we found out about it through Steinman's work. So Harvard comes up over and over again when we're dealing with this. It seems to me that Hughes doesn't just get his money because he's going to be this kind of loudmouth billionaire. He's getting the respect and the insights and the interest from the CIA and all the rest of it because he has that background and because they know he can be a trusted asset through these means. So very often, as I've pointed out, when they go and they talk about Hughes, they're talking about a caricature of, hey, this billionaire who was really into babes and eccentric. That kind of doesn't matter. What does matter is, why was this billionaire the earliest guy to consider an active space program? 1940s. Okay, so he's developing a secret space network in the 1940s. And he's using Hughes Aerospace, which will become the leader in that. By the way, by the time we get to sending people to the moon, a lot of that equipment is coming from Hughes Electronics and Hughes Aerospace. Okay, so then we have this incredibly tight connection with the political figures of the day, especially Richard Nixon. So, what we're doing is we're introducing these aspects and these forces. Now, I introduced Maheu. Maheu's kind of the counterbalance. He's the counterweight. He's kind of the price to pay to have this access and to be so rich and all the rest of it. Somebody has to be sent in there to mind him. One of the supposed conditions in their relationship is that they could never meet. They could only communicate by memo and phone. Now, I found this very fascinating because there's a heck of a lot of mind control techniques that are used around Howard Hughes. And before I go any further with Maheu, I want to check in on how we're doing with the questions tonight.
We are doing great.
Okay, and I guess we should mention here that on the second half of the program, what we do is Olivia and I she puts together a question and answer session with everybody. But you can ask her the questions all in caps because that's the way she's going to be able to track them down. And at the end of the show, or the second half of the show, we're going to go through all of your questions. And those are some of the most exciting parts of any of these episodes because everybody has so many great ideas. It's terrific to see so many people out tonight. And I definitely know that we're going to have one of the more riveting shows tonight because the information is explosive and the people who've come forward are explosive. But even more interesting is this is going to be kind of a setup for something that's coming up. And I want everyone to keep really tuned. One of the important things to keep tuned for, I'm going to announce right now, which is that next Friday, we're going to have a very important guest on the show. I can't mention who it is yet, but our normal time is Friday at 7 o'clock, of course. We did this extraordinary episode because we had the new Fitz episode to come out yesterday. But I think what's so important is that what I want to convey about that show is that it's one of these kind of important steps in this process that's happening. So definitely keep that one in mind next Friday. But as far as questions go, while I'm switching over, do you have anything you want to lay at me?
No, but I just want to say that this is a guest that has never been on the live show before.
True.
And
very true.
Yeah. Very special.
So I guess you can rule out Joseph Farrell and Alexandra. And it's going to be, it's kind of explosive information as you're getting used to on this. Okay, let's go a little bit further and look at some important people here. And Olivia, if you tonight, while we're doing this, if you come up with any questions while we're doing this, you can chime in if you want.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be kind of a little loose with the format tonight. If you come up with something, try me. That's what I'll say. And of course, it's great to have Olivia out there. She's doing a fantastic job, and you know, she really does. I mean, she gets so many of the good questions with everything that comes up, and the best way to do it is just to put your question up there, and she'll know it's there, so you don't have to hound her.
Can I ask you a question right off the
Mhm.
bat here? Okay. All right.
Please.
So Josh Randall asked, would DJ consider Howard Hughes to be one of the good guys? So going into this, it would be good to know.
I think he was good, and I think he became incredibly manipulated. But I think he started off, you know, just with ideas of patriotism and all the rest of it. I do not think that he was back there plotting with things, but I think he became actually controlled in such a kind of diabolical fashion where they used his own quirks against him. And the CIA saw him as an incredibly valuable asset because of the way that they stacked his corporation and the way they set it up as a nonprofit eventually through Nixon, let a lot of money go out the back door to their projects, which is what they needed. So that it's like this incredible non-trackable source of income and source of funding for these little ops that they wanted to do. So yeah, I don't think, I mean, you're going to see him mixed up with some pretty diabolical people and situations. There's no question about it. But I think that when we're looking at Hughes, we're looking at somebody who was manipulated early on, and who does not appear to have started off on any kind of negative footing. Yeah, excellent. That's a good question, though. Okay, let's take a look at some people. Olivia, do you have my pen? I don't have it here.
Okay.
Gracias.
It's not your red pen.
Ah,
There
thank
you.
you. Fantastic. No, I like this. It's a little lavender touch.
It's my purple pen.
It's purple pen. That's it. Okay, who are we looking at here? All very interesting people. Let's start with Van Tassel, right here. Key figure. Next to him, Frank Scully. Well, what do we know about Frank Scully? Frank Scully developed the entire X-Files with Guy Bannister, because Guy Bannister was the FBI agent in Chicago who was tracking all of this. He was the UFO guy, basically. He had to track the sightings, the national security implications, and all the rest of it. Scully was a reporter, and he worked in this kind of echelon of Hollywood people and stuff, around PR people. And he heard this incredible story about this crash in New Mexico, not the Roswell one, the Aztec crash. And in fact, he got to all the great details about it. Scully gives us, you know, later in the X-Files, the show, they'd use the name Scully for the character, the female kind of counterpoint to Mulder. And it was fascinating because Scully himself was hounded by the FBI, and they tried to debunk his stuff over and over again because he came through with all this incredible stuff about an invention, this technology around the UFO crash, all the witnesses. I mean, he really had them on the run. So they tried everything in the early 50s to debunk this guy. So here he is with Van Tassel. There's another guy there who is a speaker. He wrote a book called The Secret of the Saucers, and he got a visit from the Men in Black, and then he shut down and sort of left town. And that's Orfeo Angelucci. This guy, George Hunt Williamson, is the shorter guy over here near Scully, and that's Van Tassel. So he was like one of the big theosophists of the day, and he was close with George Adamski, who's another one of these contactee guys, who also was in touch with Hughes. So Hughes and the kind of space brother people are incredibly tight. But we're going to find that Hunt Williamson was deep with theosophy, which has the incredible mystery school tie that we've been pursuing in the entire series. Very interesting crew right off the bat. And then let's go back to Maheu momentarily. Now, Maheu is implicated in all sorts of nasty CIA shenanigans. Everything from the Bay of Pigs to the assassination of Robert Kennedy. And we're going to get into how that figures. But what else is interesting about our friend here, Robert Maheu, who was the top aide to Howard Hughes? He, for a decade, was partners with Guy Bannister in the Chicago FBI office. Guy Bannister will show up as the person who's in charge of the UFO file. He's a trackable figure. He was a major FBI guy. Later, he turns up coaching and grooming Lee Harvey Oswald in 1963, the summer before the assassination. So the assassinations, the UFO file, and the aerospace wing push, those things are part of one big tapestry that we need to keep our eye on. So Maheu, Howard Hughes' assistant, 10 years, FBI office, Chicago, with Guy Bannister. It's kind of an incredible confluence of people and influences there. And it's going to pay off as we get along here. But Maheu, is one of these characters who really comes in on the world stage. And something that happens in the late 50s is that the Nixon people, as he's VP for Eisenhower, they're looking at the 1960 election and they're saying, this revolution just happened in Cuba. We need to assassinate Castro. We can't do it through normal channels. I have to get this done if I'm going to get elected president, because it's going to make us look weak if we let this revolutionary do it. And Kennedy will come in and pretend to be tougher than we were, and he'll win. This is the thought process going on. Okay, so what they do is Nixon turns to Hughes. Now, why can Nixon turn to Hughes? This is a very important point to come to. And let's check a few notes here. This is, Nixon basically has a brother named Donald, and he runs these food chains. And he gets this incredible loan of $250,000 from Howard Hughes. And it gets tracked and brought up later, as late as 1973. And when it actually gets brought into court, Don Nixon, who's President Nixon's brother, his partner in the business dies suddenly of a heart attack. I'm like 54 years old. So it's a hard situation. They can't track it down, but everyone knows about that tight, close relationship between Nixon and Hughes. One of the first things that happens is after the JFK assassination, Robert Kennedy, in a meeting with his close aides, says, I should have been investigating Hughes and Hughes in that incredibly diabolical situation he has over there. So instantly when the assassination happens, his mind goes to Hughes and the incredible CIA infiltration of Hughes' empire. And it is a huge empire. He's basically like Bill Gates on steroids back then. And really, Hughes himself probably thinks he's being patriotic. He's in with the vice president, and he's in with all these kind of anti-communist type people. And so for him, it's not that, he's thinking of the CIA as an evil device. He's thinking of them as doing something good at preventing the spread of Soviet communism. So we have to see where some of these people are coming from to understand how they manipulated Hughes, because eventually he's going to throw Maheu overboard, and Maheu makes his life miserable. And then shortly after that whole incident, Hughes turns up dead. That whole clash of things has to be brought out. But a couple of key things, I think, when we look at Nixon, is that he, in 1957, what's happening is Hughes' empire and the aerospace side of it is getting so huge and it's getting so powerful that what happens is he's like, most of my money's going out in taxes, because they had this incredible tax bracket back then where they took something like 80% of your profits when you reached a certain level. And he was at that level. And he said, Dick, you have to help me. I'm in this situation. You need to somehow find a way to get my taxes lowered. And what he decides to do, and it's very mysterious because it gets into the whole pharmaceutical wing and how we have so many problems with the pharmaceuticals now, but this is one of the early foundation moves, which is Hughes Medical gets developed. And Hughes Medical is like, oh, we need to develop cures for cancer and all these different things. But in fact, it's a mechanism whereby Hughes can basically hide all of his profits, which, remember, a lot of this is getting kind of money laundered through the CIA. Now, an extraordinary thing happens, which is Hughes has Hughes Aerospace, and he has now Hughes Medical. And what he does is he goes to Nixon and he says, I want to make Hughes Medical nonprofit. So it's a huge nonprofit. I want Hughes Aerospace to now be a part of that nonprofit entity. And nobody would ever have gone for it in Congress and all the rest of it. Somehow Nixon rifles it through. And so Hughes' huge empire dealing with aerospace suddenly becomes a nonprofit part of Hughes Medical. And therefore he's able to keep all the money and hide all the transactions. So this is incredibly important because the CIA wants to use Hughes. They want to use his money. They want to use his resources. They want to use his aerospace connections. They want to use the technology he's developing. But here now they have an incredible smokescreen to do it through, because now they have a non-profit organization. And it's a win-win because Hughes gets to keep all the money that they were going to tax. And all of this is incredibly good because Nixon's helping him do it. And it's incredibly good for Nixon because he gets Hughes' incredible backing. The only thing wrong is that there was this weird loan back there, $250,000 that went to Don Nixon. So it comes out, this is a little bit of a problem because it looks like, and it is, a bribe, basically, to have Nixon approve this thing. So you got a very dicey situation that goes on there. And like I said, it explodes in the Watergate era. It takes a long time. I mean, it's out there, but it explodes in that period. So when we look at this kind of support on the Hughes side and where he's coming in and he has the technology, he's working on X projects. The XF-11 actually is one of his early X projects. And he's deep into researching what is going on with the UFO file. So we have the UFO file, we have Nixon, we have this funding mechanism. Now, fast forward, the CIA plots against different countries are basically facilitated, and there's incredible literature out there from Peter Dale Scott, Jim DiEugenio, and other people who track the Hughes influence on the whole CIA programs that are going on. Part of the reason that the Kennedys have to get the CIA back under their wing, and part of the reasons they have to get the UFO file back under their wing, is because Hughes is funding the CIA and they have he's part of their unlimited network. So one of the things that we've pointed out in this show is that the crux, the major clash that happens as a result of all this is involved in something called Blue Gemini. And I've explained Blue Gemini pretty much in depth, so I'm just going to give you a quick capsule. If you really want an explanation, I think it's the X episode 3 that goes into all the hijinks around Blue Gemini. But basically, it was a space program that was set up for UFO recon. And the UFO recon aspects were brought on through the X program by Walter Dornberger. Dornberger was a paperclip Nazi scientist who came over here. And we used him specifically for this. Now, one of the interesting things when we get into Blue Gemini and this UFO recon idea is this was part of the budget and part of the military intelligence connection that was getting away from the Kennedy administration. But also, this is where that split occurs, and we get, for the first time in history, an actual document, which only came out in 2014, by the way, of Robert McNamara, who was Kennedy's defense secretary, saying, look, this is a completely different space program than the public space program. What's going on? What's going on with this Blue Gemini? That's the first in-print admission of a secondary or secret space program. And what they do is they realize that there's a wing working inside of NASA trying to do this. And it involves people like Werner von Braun, who came over through the paperclip program, and Hughes. So they're setting up their own space development and their own funding corridor for it and keeping it out of the hands of Kennedy as much as they can. Well, of course, Kennedy is fascinated. What he needs to do, he realizes, is announce the moonshot. That's what he does. And he's like, we'll take things back this way. But he also does something interesting is he creates the DIA, which is the Defense Intelligence Administration. And, you know, the DIA is different from the CIA because it's a Kennedy move to move intelligence back under presidential control, under military control. So the CIA is this thing. It's got this backdoor funding. It's got the X UFO file, and it has this incredible reach in all these different programs. And the problem for the presidents since Truman, who created it, is to get it back under its original mandate. And they never did, by the way. There were a few times, like in the 70s, when they had committees and things on it. But we're dealing with a massive CIA problem going on now. And one of the real, I think, cases where we saw that was in the incredible moves by the CIA to remove this sitting president, President Trump. And like I always say to people, even if they're like Bernie Sanders Democrats, the last thing in the world that you want is the CIA calling the shots on who we elect as president. And you know for a fact, if they don't want him in, there's a good reason. And so, you know, their reasoning is not our reasoning. So therefore, we resist anything of that nature. And what we get, I think, a lot when you get into these areas with the CIA, when we look at the history, we understand them better because so much of what they do now is cloaked. And they were cloaked back then, but it takes a while to unwind. If we look at that, we've got 50, 60 years of history there. You know, now we can get a better look at who they are, where they're coming from, what they're doing. That's a big advantage. So the JFK assassination happens. In the middle of that is this tussle over Blue Gemini. Blue Gemini turns into Dynasaur, which is DYNASOAR. Dynasaur is quite important, and this is a program that is part of the Dornberger X wing. Dornberger being the paperclip scientist who came over, who was the head of the Nazi rocket program. Dornberger, we'll recall, had a very important protege at Bell Helicopter who was Michael Paine. Michael Paine and his wife, Ruth Paine, were the hosts for the Oswald, and the Oswald stayed with them in 1962 and 63. So they're basically like, that's home base. So Oswald is in fact set up as the assassin, and he's living with Dornberger's protege, Paine. So when I did a show on X Protect, which is the Garrison show, there's more information on that. But just to summarize it, you know, we're in a situation where there were so many connections around this program, there was so much secrecy around it, that when the presidential curiosity level got hard enough, you were looking at two governments, a covert one and an overt one. The public government, the public state, is what Kennedy headed up. This other thing, which had all the CIA Wall Street influence, the Hughes money, and all these other kind of secrets around the UFO file, that thing is what came out on top in that tussle. Once you assassinated Kennedy, they put in LBJ, and they called LBJ Senator NASA because he was the guy who was in charge of money for NASA. And they got their way. They moved into armaments. They had the incredible Vietnam War. All these things happened as a result of that battle going down, and the public side losing. And what you could say is the progressive side of the political spectrum. And I don't mean progressive the way they talk about progressives now, but I guess you could say the people who were concerned with a future for humanity versus this really greedy group that knew about the technology and wanted to just formulate it for themselves. Of course, one of the key aspects when we get into JFK is that he wanted to share the technology, and he's on record trying to share the UFO file late in his presidency with Russia. So that's a big no-no. Now, you know, when we get into 2016 election and they accused Trump of all these things because he's like, I don't want to have Cold War 2.0 or get into a nuclear thing with Russia. And they're like, oh, he's under collusion and all the rest of it. This is a leftover. This is the CIA's position. They don't want to share with other countries. They're not thinking of things in terms of America first either. They want to save that advantage for this deep state function. And, when you get into that deep state, those different segments inside the deep state also have their own disagreements, which I think came to the fore in 2016. But we can see when we're talking about this period, 1963, and we bring it up to the present and see the battle with Trump over Russia and the CIA, it is exactly the same function. I mean, we're looking at some 50 years of history gone by there, but they're still in that spot where they do not want anyone in on their technological edge. And, that's not just about protecting America's secrets. They're more into protecting this deep state force and all the advantages that this very small group is exhibiting in, corporate rule, in political rule. We certainly see it, so many of them are at the Davos crowd or Bilderberg, whatever it happens to be, take your pick. But there is a real split here that occurs, and it all gets us right into the heart of this period of time. So what happened in the middle of all this was something actually called the X-20. On the bottom, it says X-36, but that actually is the X-20 we're looking at there. And Dinosaur is a fascinating program because it's set up for UFO recon. And one of the things, a very important note I want us all to take into account, is the X-20 Dinosaur only lived, let's see, it was meant to return to Earth and land on an airstrip, much like NASA's iconic space shuttle or Virgin Atlantic's private endeavors. Its predecessor, and you're going to find this quite interesting, its predecessor was the X-15. Let's see if I have a shot of the X-15 here. This is the X-15, and it's an incredible piece of work by Dornberger, but here's the fascinating thing about it. Quote, among manned-powered aircraft, the North American X-15 still holds the highest record for highest altitude, 67 miles, and greatest speeds, Mach 6.7, and that was all the way back in the 1960s. It's almost like the person writing this, for the record, is kind of, oh, isn't that odd? I mean, here we are in 2018. Why does that hold the record? And it's from the 1960s. It's quite unusual. Well, it's a pretty impressive technology they're using there. Now, Dinosaur becomes very important because we mentioned Guy Bannister earlier, and if you've been watching the program, you know who Bannister is. But Bannister, being the original person for the FBI who investigated the UFO file, we have news accounts of him tracking down saucer cases, interviewing witnesses, and all the rest. And then he turns up around the JFK assassination in '63 in New Orleans with Lee Harvey Oswald. But what's fascinating and what's never been brought out, and it's in a book called Let Justice Be Done, which is about the Garrison investigation by William Davey. What happened was that Guy Bannister, he died a year after, less than a year after the Kennedy assassination, because they couldn't have him around. He was somebody who they, got to really kind of groom the patsy, and then once the patsy was killed, they had to get rid of his groomers too. So Guy Bannister dies of a heart attack, and he can't testify to the Warren Commission and all the rest of it. But all of his files get burned, taken away, whatever it happens to be. It's just, you're not going to get it. But as it turns out, his wife kept some. And one of the important ones that she kept, she actually sold in the late 60s, and some archive held on to it. It's a very unusual situation, but it's absolutely bona fide. And we don't have the actual files. What we have, though, is the naming system of the files, all the names of what the different files were. And right underneath the Kennedy assassination is X-20 Dinosaur. Now, Guy Bannister is a private eye on the surface, but we know he did all this work for the FBI and the CIA. And of course, when he was with the CIA, with the FBI in Chicago for a decade, he's with Maheu, who is Howard Hughes' main man. If we remember Maheu here from earlier, Maheu is a kind of a bombshell revelation coming up about him shortly here. So what happens is we're looking at this whole situation, and we're saying, wait a minute. We've got Guy Bannister, and his file list says X-20 Dinosaur. Why does this guy have any interest right under the JFK assassination in putting X-20 Dinosaur on his file list? What kind of trajectory was he on and grooming Oswald? And Oswald saying before he goes to Dallas, I'm going to go work for NASA. So we get later into 1968, and Jim Garrison comes forward and he says, well, you know, what happened is I found out, as he's talking to this magazine editor, he said, I found out that it's the aerospace wing that was involved in the assassination. That's the main force. Now, Hughes is in that aerospace wing. Lockheed is in that aerospace wing. Boeing is in that aerospace wing. This is the confluence of forces that he's getting at. And now we have this connection to the UFO file with Robert Maheu, who's Hughes' right-hand man, Guy Bannister, who is the original X-Files guy for the FBI, and the fact that they worked in Chicago together in the same FBI office for a decade. So we're in a totally different view of history, because what's usually brought up about these people is, well, Maheu had some CIA ties and so on, you know, and he was Hughes' guy, but, you know, Hughes was too eccentric for him, so Maheu sued him. That's the normal record. And, you know, then we have Bobby Kennedy saying, after President Kennedy's assassinated, you know, I should have looked more into Hughes and the CIA nexus that was going on. That's the first thing that comes to mind. So I think this is telling us a lot about what was shaping up there. As we go further into Hughes and what happens to him, it's going to get even more hardcore. All right, let's read some notes that are quite interesting. This takes us back. One quick thing about Howard Hughes Sr., so everybody's on the record with this. Howard Hughes Sr. entered Harvard University in 1893 and then studied law at the law school of Iowa State University. And he becomes somebody pretty big up in the Harvard Club in New York. Incredibly kind of hardcore connection there. So not just some kind of, you know, I think the way they portray him is this yokel striking it rich idea, you know, but we want to think about Hughes as coming from a very elite family. And that explains this trajectory. Yes, Hughes Tool Company, that oil company, did take off and all the rest of it and made them billionaires, which they weren't before. But he was already coming from a pretty connected setup. And there's Harvard again, as we know. Okay, a couple of odd notes about the Howard Hughes thing. Sometime in the early 50s, somebody sent the FBI this dossier on Hughes. And it reads the following. Okay. Quote, since we're on the brink of a third world conflict, the world is more air conscious than ever. This is the early 50s. Aviation in some phases is yet in its pioneering days. Much talk goes on about flying saucers or discs. The secret we speak about is not a military secret and is not yet owned by the government. The flying saucer, which was seen over South Chicago last April, is a large fuel tank with crystal glass wings. The writer continues, it has large two-jet engines on both sides. It's radio controlled. It resembles a saucer very much when in flight. It's the FBI back and forth. It's radio controlled. It resembles a saucer very much when in flight. The wings cannot be seen on a clear day. This is so it is most difficult target for anti-aircraft gunners. The reason is the large gas or fuel tank is to give the ship a long range of atomic bombing. The ship was financed by Howard Hughes, millionaire aviation enthusiast. It is now being tested by the Glenn F. Martin Aircraft Company, makers of the Martin Marauder. The craft is made for only one-way trips. You figure that out. So this is somebody kind of tipping the FBI off, saying Hughes is up to this very unusual experimental aircraft. Check it out. So now let's back up and look at Van Tassel, the same period of time that we're talking about. So Van Tassel writes in his memoir, or the book is called Road to Flying Saucer. And Van Tassel, by the way, seems, interestingly enough, like a pretty level-headed guy. But he was saying the most kind of bizarre things. So what he says is, he awoke one night to find a man standing at the foot of his bed. Quote, now this is Van Tassel, beyond the man about 100 yards away hovered a glittering, glowing spaceship, seemingly about 8 feet off the ground. The man introduced himself in English as Solganda and invited Van Tassel aboard his ship. Solganda, okay, where he divulged the schematics of the integration of the Integratron. So he gives him this kind of construction plan for the Integratron. And then Van Tassel goes to Hughes to get the money for it. And one of the things that we've established is that Van Tassel, who's one of the early major ET contactees, is close with Hughes and built this airport. And Hughes flies in. And one of the stories is that Hughes flies in because he likes Van Tassel's wife makes these pies that he just, thinks are the greatest. That's one of the worst cover stories in history. Obviously, they're working on a project, and that's why he's going over there. So pie, certainly secondary. Van Tassel's interest in flying, they go through this whole thing. In 1927, he started work for Howard Hughes, and then he went for Lockheed Aircraft. Now let's think about that, because we're talking about Van Tassel in the 50s. He's been working with Hughes since 1927. So by the time he comes out with his song and dance about Solganda and all this stuff, that's 30 years later. So he's deep, deep in the aerospace airplane development, and then becomes friends with Howard. So a little addendum. This is also interesting. This is an article in The Atlantic, okay? Now you think about The Atlantic, they love to debunk this stuff, but they were absolutely fascinated by the Integratron. Lacking funds, this is after now, in the 70s, in the late 70s, Van Tassel dies, and all of his research stops there, and they kind of explain it. And they says, lacking funds, the necessary blueprints for completion, and the charismatic leader, the Integratron project soon stalled. It sat empty for years. Van Tassel's equipment disappeared, making it difficult to determine just how much of his vision he had constructed before his death. These notes are really important, because Van Tassel, whatever he was up to with Hughes, it was taking a long time. This is 20 years of work. He does build the Integratron. That thing is very unusual, as we've seen people do all these sound acoustic things in there. But whatever was supposed to run it, whatever was supposed to be the cell regenerator, was, according to Van Tassel, associated with the Tesla technology. Very unusual set of circumstances, and a very unusual set around Howard Hughes. Let's keep all that in mind as we go into this part. Now, let's jump back to our friend, John Mayer. John Mayer reveals incredible things in this book, and I have said a few things about Mayer, but we're going to find out more about Mayer in subsequent episodes also. So if you miss something here, don't worry, because there's a lot more coming on Mayer. Here's a couple of quick things to point out, basically. A legend portrays Hughes in his glory days as an ice-cold entrepreneur, fearlessly hacking his way through the industrial jungle, guided by an infallible inner compass. In reality, Hughes was not loath to seeking assistance from the supernatural. So Mayer finds himself carrying sealed packages between Hughes' penthouse and his psychic, Peter Hurkos. Hurkos described himself as a psychometrist, one who could make psychic pronouncements after handling an object belonging to the person seeking his advice. Once Mayer escorted him up the back stairs to the Desert Inn penthouse, through the guards and into the Hughes suite, Hughes was waiting behind a one-way glass which permitted him to see Hurkos without being visible himself. Hughes intensified his use of psychics when considering major business decisions, and it showed his mental and emotional state was changing. Now Mayer's looking at him and he's saying, well, I wasn't privy to the discussions with the psychic, but he did listen to Hughes rambling on about having to preserve his body and cryogenics and all this stuff that's very advanced way back then. But part of the kind of message I think that we're getting there is that Hughes now, we find out, is deep into the supernatural. Hughes is deep into the UFO file. He's deep into ET contactee Van Tassel. There's a whole different side of what he is and what his activity is. And then we see through Maheu, who is close with Bannister and this whole CIA clique that develops around what I call X-Protect, because it seems to be the thing that UFO researchers come up against. It's the same thing that Garrison came up against in researching the CIA. It's this wall of secrecy, and it's lethal, you know, when you get certain people around it. And I demonstrated that the UFO researchers who got near it, like Frank Edwards, for example, you know, actually died, you know, under very suspicious circumstances. Jessup was another one, Morris Jessup, who wrote the case for the UFO, really the kind of stellar books, because these were intellectuals who were coming forward and discussing it. And at that point, you know, what they wanted to do is get the public off the trail. They wanted to get people to stop thinking about this. And instead, you're getting these very intelligent people sussing it out. So you had to find ways to get rid of them. But I think what we're getting here, again, with Meyer is a window. And very, very so often in this show, we get that little window. It pops open. It's almost like, you know, I mean, I'd like to attribute it to deep research, but some of it is luck, really, where we get just this kind of crack of light in the window, and we get just that kind of shot of things where the world lights up for a moment. We get a view. Now, the other thing that's important in here is that in Meyer's diary, as he publishes the actual diary in here, he keeps incredible notes about his conversations. He has incredible tension with Maheu. And in fact, Maheu really, you know, causes him everything from legal problems to being followed by CIA and all the rest of it. And Meyer, John Meyer really, I think, shows himself to be someone very dedicated in his job for Hughes. But he was somebody who was very active in the political circles, and he spent time with Bobby Kennedy, and he spent time with Ted Kennedy, and he talked to Bobby Kennedy's aides who were running the campaign and all the rest of it, because one of the things that he wanted to find out was, is Bobby Kennedy's position on no nuclear testing, basically. And he wanted that up front. But they started getting intel that Bobby Kennedy was going to prosecute them, that is the Hughes organization, the CIA aspect that had infiltrated the Hughes empire, as soon as he got in office. And nothing in their conversation dissuaded Meyer from that. But Meyer had no idea how afraid aspects, or how kind of like secretive those aspects were. And he had no idea of what they were planning. But it is quite interesting if we go to his diary entry. Now this, I want to mention a couple of quick things before we get into this, actually. One of them is there are all kinds of links when we get into Hughes and the assassinations around the Kennedys. One of the most important ones is that Hughes was the owner of the Texas Theater where Oswald is caught. And what happened at that theater is that it used to be used for spies to exchange information, because Hughes was like a super patriot. And so he built the theater, and they used it for the CIA to meet with each other and trade information and all the rest of it. And during World War II, spies would meet there to exchange information. The idea that Oswald is getting grabbed inside of the Texas Theater, which Hughes owns, is a very early kind of warning sign about Hughes' involvement and the Hughes empire involvement. And what's happening is the CIA is so entrenched through Maheu in controlling what's happening with Hughes that we start to get this version of Hughes, which is, you know, well, he's starting to act, you know, like OCD, and he's off his rocker, and he's taking medications, and, you know, he gets hooked on painkillers, whatever it happens to be. But if you think of it more as a program to control his empire and his wealth, then we're starting to get an idea of what they were doing with him. And Maheu was his control. He was the one who was his minder. And Maheu's, you know, history with the CIA and with people like Bannister is just a fact. I mean, it's not anything that's even debated by history. But the idea, when we look at it, of Hughes being that involved, where they're going to use the theater in order to bag Oswald that he owns, we're starting to get the impression that the Hughes Empire is being used for some very nefarious purposes here. So let's keep that in mind as we go along. So when you read this book, you'll understand why they chased Maheu out of the country, because he had too much information, and he really, you know, he wasn't choosing sides politically, but his information was explosive to every side. I guess we could say it that way. Okay. October 25th, 1969. Now, this is Maheu's diary. My friends and I were taken on the president's yacht all day. We also visited the president's beach house. On the yacht, I sat stunned. The president is Nixon in this case. On the yacht, I sat stunned as Don Nixon, remember Nixon's brother, after many drinks, started talking about the RFK assassination, his brother being in Texas when JFK was assassinated, and Bob Maheu telling Don about Bob's conversation with Don in Las Vegas. Maheu took credit for the RFK murder. The ones that sat around the table with their mouths opened were shocked. Don Nixon is a nice man who regrets being the president's brother. And the diary entry ends. Now, we did a show on the RFK assassination last week on the anniversary, and we went into how the security guard Caesar was someone who was working for Lockheed Martin and had a very unusual history and wound up being spirited away to Indonesia, where we still don't know if he's alive or not. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has called for new investigation because they found in 1968, when the assassination happened, they found 13 bullet holes, and Sirhan Sirhan only had 8 bullets in his gun. That was reason one. There was more reasons around it, and it got really, incredibly suppressed. But this was right after the MLK assassination, and basically there was no way to get a handle on that. They were able to railroad that investigation, and Sirhan Sirhan was definitely a mind-controlled patsy. When we look at him now, we can really get a handle on it. But Maheu, Don Nixon saying aloud at this gathering that Maheu was behind the assassination, and Maheu keeping that information and publishing it, is explosive. That's why Maheu's out of this country. And that's why the book wasn't picked up very widely, because it's absolutely explosive information. If CNN or MSNBC were normal channels, this guy would be right in the center, in the heart of it. The whole thing about Caesar and the assassination and the links back to Lockheed and the mind control aspects around Sirhan and all the rest of it have all the earmarks of what was happening around Howard Hughes and the CIA influence that were going on. Now, we have all these reports that there were doubles being used for Howard Hughes. And then you have, this group of Mormons that's in touch with him. And then we have, when he dies, this whole thing about a Mormon will, where the Mormons want to take his entire fortune. True, genuine Mormons are just practicing their religion. But the structure of Mormonism is so deeply entrenched in the CIA, and they have such a tight relationship back and forth, and how that developed, them being in Utah and being in Nevada, and Area 51, being a major force in all of the secrecy, and the Mormons really trying to survive and being, kind of under attack there for so many years. They formed these alliances with powerful figures, and over the years, the CIA was one of them. So what happens is there are all these stories about Hughes and Hughes' deterioration and the long nails and long hair and all this stuff. Maheu, who worked with him up to 1970, doesn't detect, he detects eccentricities. There's no long nails, there's no long hair, there's no, crazy man thought process. There's just kind of eccentricities and so on. So a lot of this is built up image, because remember, when he goes down, if they're trying to perpetrate this thing about the Mormon will, they think that they're going to get for the CIA this incredible treasure trove of the Hughes empire to run without this guy who might turn on them at some point, and who they've kept kind of drugged and sedated for years and years through Maheu. Interestingly enough, by the time Hughes realizes what's going on with Maheu, and he calls him just the worst liar, and he wished he'd never met him and all the rest of it, how much does he realize about what's going on? In fact, when you look at the history, it looks like the Nixon-Hughes relationship soured also, because Nixon continued to do atomic testing, and Hughes was absolutely adamant against it. Well, why was Hughes so adamantly against nuclear testing? I mean, he's a super patriot, right? Was he a super environmentalist? There's no real evidence for that. But Van Tassel and his strange encounters with the ETs, what are they telling him over and over again? They're saying, you're in terrible danger from nuclear fallout, and that's going to destroy things. Basically, you got to get a handle on it. It seems to me we can bring those mentalities together, the influence of Van Tassel on Hughes, telling him these messages. Now, who is it Van Tassel is connecting up with? Who is he meeting who's taking him on these ships? And, you know, he's been tight with Hughes all these years. We don't know really what was happening there, but it is right at the heart, the core of the issue of the UFO file. And it has nothing to do with, you know, people gathering, waiting for beings from Venus at Giant Rock, or contact in the desert. It's actually a hardcore, really hardcore, covert war with these different groups sniping at each other, trying to keep a handle on what? The UFO file. Well, people like Van Tassel, you know, coming out and really saying, look, I'm dealing with these people. This is what they asked me to build and all the rest of it. And him getting funding from Hughes, you know, we're dealing with something very powerful back there, which we're going to have to explore what the ramifications of this are. Because as we go deeper into it, we have Maheu controlling the entire aerospace venture of Hughes. And Hughes being very interested in the UFO file, and Hughes Aerospace being the one of the earliest. He has a whole division for space in the late 40s. Who else had a division for space at that point? It's, you know, it's an interesting thing when you really think about Hughes and the trajectory he came in on, inheriting this company. They were obviously planning on him being an incredible entrepreneur, and the early death of his dad allows this kind of minder to come in, and then he develops, you know, as a young guy through Hollywood, and then gets really into aviation, and they move him over and over again in these circles. So I think that one of the honest people in his circles was Meyer, and Meyer in his book gives us a very different picture of Hughes and what he was all about. But he does give us this kind of incredible gold gem, gold nugget right in the middle of all this, which is Maheu arranged the assassination. Why would Maheu do that? Well, the CIA does not want RFK to get in charge of the country. One, he'll reverse everything back to where it was with JFK, where they had to come out of the shadows and assassinate him. They'll get their hands, they'll lose that grip, that iron grip that they have, not only on armaments and drugs and all the rest of it, but the UFO file. So there's a heck of a lot at stake. But to hear this admission at such a high level, and, you know, knowing how close Meyer was with the Nixon administration, those people, he's working with them all the time, because Hughes and Nixon were incredibly tight. Remember, the whole reason that the Hughes empire can expand is because Nixon gave them what? He gave them nonprofit status for Hughes Medical, and then they moved the strange approval of Hughes Aerospace into Hughes Medical. So it's an incredibly complex situation that we have there. And I think what we're discovering is Hughes is somebody who's sort of like this mega corporate developer, and his whole thing is linked up with aerospace and aviation and all the rest of it. And he's surrounded and infiltrated by this CIA force, which is bringing forward things like assassination plots and all the rest of it, of foreign governments, and finally governments here. Now, I think when we look at Hughes and what the supposed deterioration that happened later, and the fact that they try to push this Mormon will and get the money for the CIA, we're seeing that Hughes at some point moved against the program. And there's a very unusual tag on all this, which is the whole story of Melvin and Howard, where this guy picks up basically a hitchhiker and drives him around, and he has to be dropped off in Las Vegas. And then later, there's a will that this will circulates, and it names him in the will. And if you've ever seen Howard, it's a very unusual, if you've ever seen Melvin and Howard, it's a very unusual thing, because Melvin himself is somebody who's, it seems like something very strange. Somebody's using some incredible op there to pull him into all this, whatever it was. And they may have set up the entire thing to pull this off. But whatever it is, we're seeing that they were trying to get their hands on that. And when you look at Hughes Aircraft and Hughes Aerospace, they've built really some of the most impressive things. Most of the satellite structures have come from Hughes Aerospace. And, Hughes Aerospace got swallowed up by Boeing eventually. But Hughes Aerospace featured very prominently in the Clinton administration, because there was this whole thing about how we gave satellite technology to the Chinese too early, and that there was a huge thing about it. And the guy in the middle of that was Ron Pandolfi. And Pandolfi is somebody who we find showing up in the To the Stars Academy now. He's the CIA, like their top scientist. And he's the main driver behind the whole narrative about TTSA. So we have to see that this is an ongoing process, an ongoing program that they're involved in. And I think what I want to do is cover a couple of quick points, and then we're going to get into your questions. And Olivia, how are we doing over there?
We're doing great. We have tons of great questions already.
Excellent. Well, it's a fantastic group, and it's a huge turnout for everyone. I really appreciate seeing everyone out there. And it's great that you're joining us on Saturday. Of course, next week we'll return on Friday at 7 as usual. It's our usual time. And this week was special, and I think you can see why. Okay, a couple of quick things. The book is called Age of Secrets. That's John Meyer's book. I highly recommend it. The author, it's as told to a Las Vegas newspaper man named Gerald Bellett, B-E-L-L-E-T-T. But we may, fingers crossed now, but we may have Meyer coming on the show. So keep that in mind, because he's going to fill in a lot of things that we haven't yet got to here. Although we're cooking right along. Okay. Let's see. Hughes Chinese satellite. We did get to it. Thank God. Oh, yeah. Interesting. Here's an interesting fact about Howard Hughes before we turn it over to Olivia. Ready? Howard Hughes had a hangar at the Area 51 base and received word of nuclear bomb tests nearly a full day before the public. That's the kind of clout that he had with Nixon, that he was able to do that. But let's think about this. Hughes has his own hangar at Area 51. Area 51 is where they develop the UFO file, and it's where they develop all this experimental aircraft. So Hughes has his own hangar there. So obviously he's aware of and deep inside of this redevelopment. So when we look now at Hughes, we can put him in the context where he should be, which is right in the heart of UFO file secrecy, and right in the heart of the deepest deep state political intrigues that we have. We can understand Hughes and how he was manipulated a lot better. But then if we get into Maheu and his whole CIA role, and then the fact that Meyer is saying in his presence, Don Nixon said that Maheu arranged the RFK assassination, we're understanding now what it is that took place back there. And that gives us a much better framework to understand what's going on, over the past 50 years, bringing us into this period. So let's leave on a few quick points. Hughes deeply into the supernatural. Peter Hurkos is one of his main guides, psychic Peter Hurkos. Van Tassel, his close aide since 1927, personal in-flight inspector, one of the biggest contactees of all, built the Integratron, which is, like I said, where they have the whole contact in the desert thing out there now. Has Giant Rock Airport, where Hughes flies in all the time. And we're also looking at an incredibly close relationship there between Van Tassel and Hughes. I mean, it's undeniable stuff. So we keep that in mind, and then we think the person who's controlling the business interest for Hughes is the FBI partner in Chicago for 10 years with Bannister. I mean, Bannister being the FBI X-File guy who eventually winds up coaching and sort of creating the Patsy and being in charge of the Oswald program in New Orleans in 1963. These things, you know, we get really into the heart of the UFO file, and we get into the heart of where the secrecy comes from. And then the X factors are undeniable. I could have listed the Hughes X programs, but I think you get the idea. The XF-11, and they've been using the X Steganography in the Hughes organization since before he was born, which tells me that Harvard connection of his dad really brings a lot of this together. And then we leave on the fact that Hughes, basically, you know, with his own hangar at Area 51, has access to everything experimental that's going on there relating to the UFO file. I think we're right at the heart of what the secrecy is all about. And with that, I will turn things over to the lovely Miss Olivia.
All right. Okay, so first question. A cult fan wants to know if Howard Hughes knew Jackie Gleason.
Well, you know, he knew a lot of Hollywood celebrities, and I don't have info that he knew Gleason, but it's interesting because it wouldn't surprise me that he did, because it is interesting. It seems like the real hardcore celebrity hangouts that he's doing happen more in the 30s and 40s, and by the 50s is a little more reclusive. But because Gleason is a friend of Nixon's and Hughes is a friend of Nixon, it's certainly possible. I haven't seen anything on the record about it, though. So if you run across it, let me know.
Okay. Davey wants to know, did Howard Hughes have any children? Are they running his company / money now? And JJK is asking, who inherited all of Hughes's wealth?
Oh, it's a really weird situation that happened with the will. Basically, there was, I think, a third wife who could have inherited a lot, but she didn't challenge anything because she asked for a divorce in the late 60s. And it was an unusual arrangement anyway, where he got married and then he basically just never showed up. You know, whatever that was all about, it probably was a CIA wedding just to keep him kind of active in the social register. What happened with his death is interesting because there was a melee that took place around his will. And there were cases where aides came forward and said, hey, this is the real will, and this is the real will. And there's no doubt that one of the ones that looked the most legitimate was Noah Dietrich's. And it was interesting because the whole case really, you know, they were saying, well, it's not necessarily legitimate. And then they had people who acted against him. But in that will, they had a number of things in there where he was giving money to organizations and charitable and all the rest of it. What winds up happening instead is they give the money away to these 22 cousins who, on one side, who Hughes never knew or interacted with, but they just tracked through blood. And they gave them this kind of windfall, and they also gave themselves a big bonus through these organizations and government organizations that had nothing to do with Hughes. And this is the way it was all kind of ferreted out. The real impact of getting that money, well, I think the Mormon will was the first real stab at it. And this is that weird will that shows up that supposedly where he leaves all this money to the Mormon Church. I think that's the one they were trying to hoist on the public. But he did certainly have Mormons who worked for him. But the idea was, because Mormons didn't drink or have these kind of habits that would make them unreliable, he felt they were very good to have as aides. But I think in the grand scheme of things, we have to look at it and say, whatever it was, or whoever took advantage and took control of that case in the end, it's quite unusual, because everyone who was an aide to Howard Hughes said he was always on top of these types of things. He never left things hanging. He would have never gone out without a real will. So obviously the intelligence manipulated the will situation, and that vast empire just got sucked up. It's a gigantic sucking sound.
Nicholas Karupas, DJ, any connection between D.H. Byrd and Howard Hughes?
Well, only that they're tangentially related because of the JFK assassination. Of course, D.H. Byrd owned the Texas School Book Depository, and he also created the Civil Air Patrol, which is where they got Oswald from when he was 15 and put him in these programs. So it is quite an unusual setup. But the interesting connection, I think, with Byrd is, and something I pointed out last summer, it's never been on the record, and I still think it's earth-shattering, which is that D.H. Byrd's cousin is Admiral Byrd, who went to Antarctica and experienced what? A bunch of saucers flying at him, and a bunch of discs basically acting hostile. And he comes back to Chile, and he talks to this reporter and says, oh my God, you know, we had a war, a world war, but now we're going to have a war with these discs at the poles. Forget it. And then they silenced him. And then what's really strange is that later, Byrd's son dies under very mysterious circumstances in kind of modern period. And he's heading over to pick up an award for his dad. And he dies under just bizarre circumstances. So I think whatever was going on there, again, the X Protect, the secrecy factor really weighs in heavy. And I think until we get a handle on what the X Protect is, then we're not going to understand how people just bing, bing, bing get eliminated. You know, but that is a fascinating question.
Daniel Natal, did Howard Hughes know Jack Parsons from JPL?
Oh, of course. Yeah. You know, and I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because I have some stuff here about Parsons. And it's quite shocking, actually, because what happens is that Parsons works for Hughes after developing all this stuff for JPL. And Parsons, of course, is this incredible figure. They have a CBS series on now about him, a miniseries. It's quite unusual. But we know that Parsons was very close to Crowley and was very deep in the OTO magic. And that's a lot of black magic, but he really thought he was summoning these spirits by creating this rockets. And he was one of the best. He's like our Werner von Braun. There's no question about it. But what's interesting is he finds himself in this situation where he's working to move to Israel. This is quite unusual. Parsons. And they find him slipping information to the Israeli government about Hughes' rocket program. And so he absolutely loses it, Hughes, that is, and he demands that he be tried as an Israeli spy, which I find quite interesting because you're getting into black magic and the rocket program in Israel. They are all in one swoop. But look at this. This is interesting. This is the actual FBI document about Parsons trading secrets to Israel from Hughes. You'll note the X up there, and you'll note the X down here. Whenever we get around these files relating around the UFO file or around the Tesla energy, the X's are always there. Now, like I'm saying, I always look for the X traditionally. And when I looked at all the other files related around Parsons, I didn't find the X anywhere. But when it came to him stealing the information from Hughes, the X's show up all over the board. So I think we're seeing that steganography in the documents. This is the document dealing with Tesla. And again, that's the same X's showing up there over and over again whenever you get into it. Now, somebody, you know, we deal so much with the X Steganography in the series that you can say, well, if they put an X on an FBI document, you know, that's just something that they do. Sure. Okay. But always around these cases, the X is used. It's an internal marker for these things. It's easy. You have a lot of agents who deal with it. You can't take each one of them in for a briefing and say, every time you're dealing with the UFO file, what you do is you say, here's your protocol that you learn. When you deal with the UFO file, when you're dealing with this factor, the X is the way that we communicate with each other about it. So that way we can have different levels and different echelons of understanding and purpose in dealing with it. So interestingly enough, what happens is he is siphoning this information off from the Hughes Electronics, Hughes Aerospace to Israel. So they do this whole shebang, and Hughes is losing it because he really wants to prosecute this guy. But strangely enough, after about 3 months, they let him go, which I think is extraordinary. And nobody really can explain why that happened, because he caught him pretty red-handed. Now, I have a picture here that might give us an answer as to why he was protected in the first place. Let's see. And it gets to be like, you know, an interesting situation with Parsons, because Parsons is using magic. Parsons shows up in the birthplace of Scientology with his close friend L. Ron Hubbard, who steals his wife and his fortune and his boat. As far as it's not an easy life for Parsons. Here's Parsons doing one of his rituals. That's Parsons here. And yeah, it's quite the black magic scene. I mean, he's deep into it. And I always tell this funny story about, you know, he has all these letters back and forth with Aleister Crowley, who's supposed to be the beast incarnate himself. And he's writing to him. And he writes to him about, you know, the incredible charisma that L. Ron Hubbard has. And like, you know, but as he writes him more and more, it's like, you know, more and more things are going wrong with Hubbard. And Crowley writes him back and says, you know, I don't know. I don't know about the morals and the ethics of this guy. Are you sure you should be dealing with him? It's great. If Aleister Crowley is questioning your morals, you know, you have some problems there. So that should make all the Scientologists in the audience feel good. Okay, what else you got?
All right. So Brittany Proshin says, Bree and Kari ask, was John G. Trump connected to the Hughes Electronics Aerospace? And did Hughes consult with John G. Trump or any connection to the Tesla files?
Well, that is fascinating. If that is the Bree, I'm saying Bree is has a very fascinating story to tell, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about it. But that's an excellent question. You know, I looked for traces of Hughes in the Rad Lab, and it's quite interesting because what happens is in the Rad Lab, you have Vannevar Bush, you have John G. Trump, you have the Varian brothers, you have Fred Terman, and you have the Comptons. This is an incredible brain trust. But there's an interesting story that comes up, which is after the Roswell crash, they call in Howard Hughes. And Hughes comes in, and they say, and he's particularly interested in the craft. He's not interested in the bodies. And he says, I want to work on this, but he starts bossing everybody around, basically. And this is, from what we know, this is very much a Hughes thing. And he's such a control freak about it that basically, when it comes to dealing and redeveloping the UFO side straight up with him, working side by side, that they say, oh, this guy wants to take over the project, we can't let him do it. But apparently what they did with him is he had kind of a back door in working on the UFO file, which is after they got to a certain stage, they'd call him in and he got to demonstrate with Hughes Aerospace the things that this stuff could do. But the level of the Rad Lab is kind of a different level. They're like, the Rad Lab is that group like Vannevar Bush who examines and takes on the scientific implications. And then Hughes is a great builder. So what they did is they kind of had him one step removed from that aspect when the crash originally happens, when they do the crash retrieval and the analysis. What they do is he's like a secondary actor who can put the technology that they've developed into play. And in terms of John Trump is deep, deep, deep in the RAD lab. So he's under that MIT umbrella again. So basically, they're on one level, examining the stuff, bringing it up to a certain level, and then the CIA turns over what they've developed to Hughes to make in his aerospace wing. So it's an interesting connection, but they don't work. They're working in tandem, but they don't work on the same timing. That is, they wait and they develop. So the way that group worked, Neumann, Fred Terman, John Trump, Vannevar Bush. Vannevar Bush, remember, his protege was John Trump. Terman, who developed Silicon Valley, who were his proteges? The Varian brothers. And the Varian brothers developed, they came from Halcyon, which was the Theosophical Utopia. And they were working with all the mystery school information that John Varian, their dad, had set up with. Who was he working with? Besant, Annie Besant. And it's a very interesting trajectory to have all those people working together. It's fascinating. But yeah, great question.
Line of Judea. Where is the most likely place of any physical UFO file and who controls it?
Well, it's interesting because what I talk about in this show is stealth archives. Stealth archives are there, and they do tell us. I mean, the UFO file, for example, Robert Sarbarker. Let's see if I have Sarbarker here. Okay, here's Robert Sarbarker. Robert Sarbarker is a physicist who came forward and said, oh yeah, I worked on those programs. He came forward in 86, said this. Yeah, I worked on those programs. I'm shocked that they're still classified because basically, we went through all these things and the beings that were operating them, they must have been almost like insect-like because of the type of impact, that the stuff could really accelerate. They must have had really incredible kind of lightweight exoskeletons. And he gives out all this information, dies shortly afterwards, unfortunately. But he becomes non-person, as I've pointed out here. So Sarbarker, in what he said, is one of these things. It's quite a revelation because he was working, and he identified Vannevar Bush as working on the UFO file, in charge of the entire program of the UFO file. He's working directly with the X technology, Vannevar Bush, and Sarbarker is one of his guys. But Sarbarker is one of the most incredible Harvard physicists that the world's ever seen. He's like, he's on the level of some of the greatest. And, he's the only reason he's not ranked as an Oppenheimer or something is because he opened his mouth about UFOs, basically. Now, interestingly enough, something I pointed out about the non-person part, let's take a look at this. Just plug in Sarbarker, one of the top physicists in the country, into Wikipedia, and they're going to give you that, which is Sarbarker does not exist. It's non-person there. He's down the memory hole, but I can tell you for sure that Sarbarker does exist. He was one of the most important physicists in the world, and that's another picture of him. It's very hard to get information about Sarbarker, and I find it very mysterious in the age of the internet that they can black somebody out on Wikipedia. And I mentioned this the last time I brought up Sarbarker, which is that, Olivia told me that one of the dwarfs from The Wizard of Oz has his own Wikipedia page, but Sarbarker doesn't. Does that strike you a little unusual? It's definitely odd. Okay.
Okay. To Beretta, what connection was there between Valiant Thor and Howard Hughes?
Well, Valiant Thor is one of these personages who shows up under very unusual circumstances. He's somebody who comes in and claims that he's an extraterrestrial, and he's a well-dressed guy, And they think that he's pulling a prank, but they supposedly get to know. Now, we know all this because of Frank Stranges, who was this minister who wrote a book about it. And he was a minister who dealt with the Pentagon and all the rest of it. And he wrote Stranger at the Pentagon. Somebody tried to make a movie out of that. I don't know what happened to it, but I've never seen it. But I have read the book. And he claims that this person said, you know, I'm from another world and I'm here to help you not blow yourselves up and all the rest of it. And that Nixon and Eisenhower, who he had dealt with this guy. Now, you have to kind of take his word for it. But strangely enough, the whistleblower Phil Schneider also claimed to have met Val Thor. So it is an unusual story. But in terms of him meeting Hughes, I don't have anything on that, although he definitely met Nixon and became close with Nixon. So in the story, anyway, if we are to believe Frank Stranges. Now, we don't have any documentary proof about Val Thor, but it's quite a unusual story, let's face it.
Okay, plays live. Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Is it an ongoing X program for genetic engineering / transhumanism?
Wow. Well, I think the medical part became a CIA hangout. And one of the interesting things is early pharmaceuticals, you know, that early push around pharmaceuticals, the CIA being so close with a lot of these, you know, German companies. And this is what comes in over and over again when you're looking at it, which is a lot of those ex-Nazi companies show up, you know, in the whole pharmaceutical world. And of course, when you get to the 1980s, you've got Don Rumsfeld running the company that comes up with, what is the name of that sugar substitute?
Equal? What? Oh, you mean the saccharin? Like?
Yeah, no, it's what Betty Martini, aspartame. That's it, yes. So they develop aspartame as the ultimate. But then later, you know, it starts knocking people dead with cancer, and they start to like, what else is this used for? And it's like formaldehyde for preserving bodies. So definitely not good for the human species. But you have Rumsfeld at the top of that. Now it's very unusual because in Peter Dale Scott's research, he tracks Donald Rumsfeld, who was the defense secretary twice, and as the youngest and almost the oldest defense secretary. But he is the defense secretary under Ford in 1976, and he's also the defense secretary under W. Bush in 2001. So that's an unusual career trajectory. I can't think of anybody who shows back up 30 years later and takes over their post again. But in between, he's this big pharmaceutical chemical company baron, and he develops aspartame, and there's all these incredible health outcry about aspartame, and it's such an outcry that eventually Pepsi takes it out, but then they sneak it back in under a different name. So yeah, it's a very unusual story, and I think when you get into that, you see that manipulation. But specifically with Hughes, I think that they just took advantage of him wanting to, you know, being like, he had a lot of different ambitions. You know, he wanted to break the aviation records of flying around the world. He wanted to create a solve for cancer, you know, so he had all this money, he could move into these different areas. And honestly, I think they just took advantage of it, because by placing the aerospace company under the medical thing to make it non-profit, makes you think that they literally developed that wing mostly just so they could develop the aerospace projects in a black way that couldn't be tracked by traditional government sources.
Chia Marley said, Daniel, I just did a Google search for Sarbacher and got many results. Why do you say he cannot be found online? You didn't say that.
No, it's not that he can't be found the way, first of all, he's not found on Wikipedia. That's the crux of this, which is the modern encyclopedia. So that is the page, and let me prove this out and show it to you again. No, I mean, if you dig, you'll find little things, but you find that he is largely a non-person. I mean, he actually existed, so you can't wipe him out completely. But if you keep him out of the conversation enough, then it has the impact of, you know, leaving him out of the conversation. And that's a kind of what you would call, you know, that's a censorship, because if you look for example, for Oppenheimer, you're going to find incredible things about Oppenheimer. But Sarbarker, remember, a lot of those links that you'll find when you Google Sarbarker are going to be for UFO zines that know about him, or UFO sites that know about him. Traditional sources are very scant on Sarbarker, oddly enough. You have to dig, and there's no question about that. So, you know, it's highly unusual, let us say, that they would put him in this place where, if you search Wikipedia, like I said, you know, one of the dwarfs from Wizard of Oz, this is a great observation by Olivia, has their own page. What happened to his? And there's your search result if you try it out. Okay, and you can read it. It says here, this page, Robert Sarbarker, does not exist. So there's no denying it. And it's a fascinating thing, because why would you leave Sarbarker out? Well, what did he tell Bill Steinman? He said, oh yeah, I worked on the UFO file. I worked with Vannevar Bush. He was in charge of it. So, you know, I mean, I think that tells us a lot. One thing I forgot to show, by the way, do you remember the FBI message where the guy was like, Howard Hughes is funding this very unusual, you know, kind of super advanced craft. Keep an eye on him. It was spotted over Chicago and stuff. You may recall a little bit earlier I mentioned that. Well, the name of it, according to the guy, was Danse Macabre. And the real representation of Danse Macabre, let's take a look at this. Of course, you've got the classic X here, which is a skull and crossbones. And this is the name of this super experimental saucer that this guy was talking about to the FBI that Hughes had developed. Well, Danse Macabre is a pretty unusual name for it. It goes back to the 13th century, and Danse Macabre is this kind of weird story. It has a kind of a Wizard of Oz quality to it, where these three living, dignified people run into these three dead ancestors who are kind of like skeletal, and they tell them all about the afterworld and are like, you know, stop being so obsessed with your riches because you need to develop your kind of esoteric reality and your spiritual vision. It's a very unusual story, and kind of like, it has a Grimm's fairy tale, and then it's a little bit creepy. I'm not going to lie. But fascinatingly enough, right in the heart of the Danse Macabre is the X, right, with the skull. Fascinating. There was one more odd thing I wanted to show, which I forgot. Bear with me. This is, there's a PR company which is familiar to people who watch my interview with Doug Caddy, because he worked there actually. And whoever set him up there must have known that he was going to become close friends with E. Howard Hunt, who said to Caddy that before he went to prison that the reason that JFK was assassinated by the CIA was because of the UFO file. Well, interestingly enough, Hughes used Mellon as their PR firm, oddly enough. And Mullen, they also were used by ITT. Now, ITT is a company that's going to come up in a couple of episodes, absolutely crucial. But I want to show you the entrance to their office here in New York, in their building. Quite remarkable shot here. This is definitely on the cosmic side for a communications company. And where are they coming from? We're definitely going to find that out in an upcoming episode. Okay, Olivia, you're up.
Okay, so do you actually think that Valthor was legit?
I don't think we know, but I think...
What's your gut tell you?
There's something to the story, for sure. But I think the thing is, you know, what's odd about it is that Stranges is a minister. So it's a weird thing for him to come out and lie. That would be kind of, you know, it just seems like an odd thing for a minister just to come out and lie and make up the story about an ET. So whoever it was, he said that people there at the Pentagon knew about Valthor, you know. Now, it could have been some kind of a psyop to test out how people would react to it. It's possible.
Okay, David Tormita. So DJ, are you saying that Hughes was connected to the JFK assassination?
There's no question that the CIA infiltrators that were working to overthrow, with the deep state, to overthrow the government that was there, had access to Hughes resources because they had used those resources to try to assassinate Castro. And this is something that flipped out Bobby Kennedy and Jack Kennedy, and they threw those groups out and they try to tamp those groups down. But what happened instead was those groups came back with a vengeance over and over again. And that's what gave the Kennedys the impression, well, we don't have control over this government. How can we get a handle on this if the CIA, this wing of the CIA, this segment, is making its own rules? What are we going to do? So this is the nature of that exchange. So Hughes himself organizing it, no, but how the CIA used Hughes and his people is the same reason that Richard Nixon came to Hughes and said, look, I need you to develop this S-40 group, and I need you to send them in to assassinate Castro so that I don't lose the election in 1960. So this is how they, this is how they arrange things. This is how they use the Hughes organization. They'd appeal to his patriotism. This guy, Castro, is with the Russians, and he's a communist right off our shores. Help us eliminate him, and everyone will be happy. And remember the tremendous favor that Nixon had done for Hughes by allowing his medical charity to be the umbrella wing for his aerospace company, so he didn't have to pay taxes. It could become a nonprofit. I mean, so there's incredible things connected there. But I would say that they used Hughes assets, and it's a reason why Bobby Kennedy, the minute he gets the news, the first thing that he tells his aides is, I should have gone more hardcore on the Hughes organization with the CIA tie-in and what they were doing there, because he understands the CIA is abusing the Hughes empire. So yeah, it's complex. That's a complex answer.
Stephen Visible, was Howard Hughes a founding member of Majestic 12?
No, they kept him. They definitely kept him on this secondary level, secondary perch. They needed him, but they had to keep him in the dark, it seems like. So the people who are on that first level, we know would be like James Forrestal and Vannevar Bush and Sarbarker. These are people who are in the know. And for my money, the Varian brothers are right in the heart of that, because they came out of the Rad Lab, which had the incredible secrecy. So yeah, incredible, but good question.
Najat Madri, could there be more than one secret space program, since there are so many factions connecting to X?
Well, I'll tell you what I have discovered, that the secret space program is the wrong name. What it is, if you look at the continuity of government program, which is put in place so that we would have survived a nuclear holocaust, and it puts a whole government in place. That's continuity of government, COG. But what controls continuity of government is something called the Doomsday Network. And they're a network of communications and processes that are in place in case something like that ever happens, so that we'll have a functioning government. The secret space program works the same way. The program is just one aspect of a network. So it's the secret space network is what we're dealing with. Just like when you're dealing with continuity of government program, you're dealing with the Doomsday Network. So the network makes the program. So if somebody says, hey, there's a secret space program, well, that's actually incorrect. What it is there's a secret space network, and they have a variety of programs. So yeah, there is no, there is a singular network that creates the programs, but there's not a program. It's not a secret space program. So it's a secret space network that has programs.
Okay. Zen Ignorance, will there be a rollout of X tech from the breakaway civilization to keep America?
I'm excited by this question too.
Okay. I start over?
I think
To
that's a
keep
good idea.
America a superpower.
Okay, let's start that all over again.
Okay.
Will there be a rollout?
Of
Yes.
X tech from the breakaway civilization to keep America a superpower?
It's a great question, actually. And I made you do it twice, but I heard you the first time. I just wanted to hear it again. I think that they are planning on rolling out some of the X technology. When they talk about the Space Force, and when Trump talks about getting that, he wants to get his hands on what's going on there. And what happened was he put the Space Council back together, and it had been laying dormant. One of the big things that the Bushes decided to do was, Bush and Quayle were going to do this whole thing about going to Mars, and they had the Space Council thing. And what happened was it got on the back burner. And then, oddly enough, in 2014, Obama said, I'm going to charge that Space Council up out of the blue. And he never did it. But then finally, with Pence and putting Pence in charge of it, Trump made this decision to open that up. And then he tried to make the Space Corps something that he tried to push through Congress, and they wouldn't let him do it. And he wanted the Air Force to answer directly to them. So there's no question that they have plans for moving the technology out. But the levels that they're on with it are so far beyond, I would say, what we've been able to, that anything that we get a look at, basically. So the latest thing they have out there is the X-73B. And I had a picture, some of the developments, one of the latest X-ones for the block, for Lockheed, the Blackbird, and this is something that they've tried to imitate in things like the X-Men and stuff like that. I mean, these are pretty sophisticated designs for these space planes. There's no question about it. And I think that they are, when we see this stuff, it is going to be quite challenging because we've been kept in such a rut, as it were. The end of the first round of the X technology that swept off from Dornberger was the X-29. I did get a shot of that for this show. That's the X-29 in action. Pretty sophisticated stuff. And these are incredibly fast space planes. And but that's I think this picture is from the 80s. So the X-37B is space ready. I mean, it's really advanced stuff. Okay.
Tricky Vicky says, define X tech, please.
The X technology is what they've been hiding. And it's an advanced form of technology that is not just ET related, apparently. There's an aspect of it being ET related, but when we say UFO file, we've got stuff that goes back to the Theosophical Society hiding Keeley's technology with good reason, because of the corporate raiders that wanted to come in and exploit everybody with it. And then we got 2 world wars anyway. But the X technology really is something that goes all the way back to Atlantis, apparently. And it represents such an advanced jump in how we understand and utilize reality that it presents a tremendous challenge to us. But in the modern era, it's pretty well known as the UFO file, is the idea of the advanced technology in the UFO file. But the X technology is something that's so advanced that in terms of, there are people that have tapped into the idea, like Tesla, which is why we touch on his stuff, John Keeley and others. And it's this kind of understanding of energy in a totally different fashion as a way to utilize energy. And the kind of the side effects, or the downside, is this apotheum, which is, it's such a reality distorter that if we don't have the right handle on it, then it spins out of control of the people trying to greedily access it. But in terms of what's been suppressed, there are great technological advances that have been suppressed on that side. And some of that relates to the X technology. So yeah, it's a moving diagram.
Julie Smith, has UFO research really been about building the AI system? Seems MIT and Stanford are connected.
There is an MIT, there's there's a lot to say about AI. The transhumanism aspect is the most disturbing, really, because it is the idea of surrendering the, the human progress to this other progress. And the way that they interpret it, they have very occult ways of looking at that also, which is they're transmuting themselves from an animal into a mineral level. And that helps them move along the tree of life. In fact, AI is something that is growing rapidly in the background, and it's something that we're going to have to interface with, but it gets very deeply into this kind of harmonic progression that we've talked about Ahriman in these shows. When you're dealing with the X aspects, you're dealing with AI, you're dealing with the harmonic force. And so it is, how do you keep something like that benevolent for humanity, as opposed to how do you use it to control humanity? And this is the danger with it. What's interesting is you have humanity on one side, but there are other forces also. And, if you go deeper, as we do with this show, when you look at the harmonic stuff, getting their hands on that and controlling humanity through that, then you can see it's a window. It's kind of a vulnerability and no longer an advantage. So the culture is going to need the upgrade on a kind of ethical and metaphysical level in order to handle these things. Because if you lay these types of advances out on the culture as it stands, and then you feed the culture and downgrade the culture so you can kind of harvest them the most, it's a recipe for disaster in the grand scheme of things. But great question.
John K., is there any evidence of rivalry between Hughes and Lockheed?
I think that he had all kinds of rivalries, and I think that Lockheed regarded him as a wild card, and that they kept an eye on him. It looks to me like once he kind of got in with Maheu, and once the CIA started to control Hughes, that he became much less of a wild card, and that he became somebody who, they may have actually, they certainly applied certain types of mind control to him, but they may have also tried to electronically control him, because there are lots of unusual stories about Hughes and his appearance changing. I have this incredible picture somewhere of him working, sort of escaping, and he turns up working as an aide for people, basically like a luggage carrier at Pan Am. I mean, there's some things which we understand as his own eccentricity, but other things that I think he was really manipulated, and they really worked on his psyche, which is what they're really quite good at. Okay.
Okay.
You're
so,
up.
Davey, I love this question. Is there or has there been an X age?
Well, we definitely are coming into a major X period. I think that the X aspects rise and fall. They apparently were at their height, the first height in Atlantis. And we suffered dramatically as a result of those things being out there. Now, when you go into that, you're also talking about spiritual technology. So you have to kind of get into that. But I would say that a good way to look at the X steganography and the technology it's referencing is that programs like CERN come out of the same programs that the Rad Lab were developing to help America win World War II. And that is very close to what we're discussing here as the X. So when you get into particle accelerators, when you get into that original discovery of the Varian brothers around the klystron, which is the foundation for all of those microwave radars where we can do radar in space and all the rest of it. Obviously, the X on a technical physical level, that's an incredible advancement for the culture. But the X has a spiritual counterpart in it. And that's, it's definitely, there's an incredible opportunity for us to move into that. But in terms of the age, I would say we're moving into the age.
JJK, I wonder if some of Hughes, who was supposed to be such a great pilot, plane accident were arranged.
Excellent point. I didn't really get into his plane accidents so much, but certainly that major one that happened in 46 where he crashed with the XF-11, which was his experimental aircraft, and where they say he was disoriented, which is quite unusual, and that after the plane crash, he started to have a lot of phobias that he didn't have before and all the rest of it. I think that when you look at Hughes' life, you can see that he's very targeted in that you have to kind of forget the different biographies that we've heard about him and just look at him as this very unusual figure who, at 19, inherits this incredible company from these Harvard elites, because that's what his family really were. And they were very tightly connected to be in the Harvard Club in New York and all the rest of it. So when he inherits all this, he's given these different minders over time. And then, you know, he gets out there in his 20s and he wants to be a Hollywood director. He wants to be an aviator and all the rest of it. And then you can see that they've developed a really good personality profile for how to manipulate this guy and all of his wealth. So I think we need to start to understand him in a different way.
Neil Thompson 32 just wrote, all DNA goes back to the Antarctic. Have you looked into that, DJ? Do you know anything about that?
It's an interesting question. You know, the DNA studies, I don't really trust what we get in traditional DNA studies. I do think the DNA study I've been trying to pay attention to is this one that relates to this X DNA that they found in Native Americans that they think relates to this older culture, which is obviously Atlantis. And those I think are interesting studies, but I don't know much about the Antarctica one.
I just want to throw this in here, if I can find it. Okay, so Line of Judea says Ancestry.com is owned by the Mormon Church, and their DNA collection business is to store your DNA and then rebaptize you into their religion when you die.
Who said that?
Fact, Line of Judea.
Wow, that's interesting. I've heard about unusual things being done with those companies, but I can't confirm that the Mormons own that. I will try to confirm that. That's fascinating if it's true, however. And we do know that the Mormons have this process, which is they will baptize the faithful after they're dead if they didn't get baptized, as a way to have everyone under the same baptismal umbrella in the afterlife. You know, but I mean, you know, in the early days, they also baptized their 40 wives too. So it's a very unusual series of rituals.
Ava Welsh, DJ, do you think AI is being developed as the eighth sphere to use our consciousness to control us?
Well, it's interesting. And the eighth sphere is something we just did a program on. We have it as part of a key part of the X series. And just to let everyone know, the eighth sphere is something that came up in anthroposophy, and he described it as something that was being set up artificially by these forces in evolution, one of them in particular called Ahriman, which, you know, in anthroposophy, you leave this life, you move on into other systems, and you come back and you reincarnate. That's the way theosophy and anthroposophy works. But the realms that you go through are meant to develop you for different types of things. So there's like a Jupiter realm that you go through and then you come back. But in this, in the eighth sphere, what happens is that all of your fantasies and all of your life go into this other realm. It's like an artificial evolutionary step, and it's a downgrade, and it interrupts the natural flow because the forces that are doing that want to keep our evolution with them instead of where we would progress to. So the eighth sphere is kind of an artificial construct by these forces, according to anthroposophy. But with your question, I've always felt that virtual reality and the way that, remember, because so much of it, the way Steiner identifies is about your fantasy life, what you project, what you think about, you know, thoughts or things. We've heard that in the esoteric tradition. So if they can get your thinking wrapped up unnaturally and obsessively, like with virtual reality, you experience things with your brain that you don't experience physically. There can be a detachment there. So I think things like artificial intelligence relate to the eighth sphere, which is not to say that artificial intelligence is entirely evil. it's just that something, it's one of those things which you have to be very careful when you use it to understand the boundaries between your kind of soul spirit life, your mental life, and this thing that this projection, as it were. So, but it's a great question.
Forgive me if I'm pronouncing this wrong. Cyan Lochnan. DJ, do you think Howard Hughes was an early MK Ultra guinea pig? And Ice Angel wants to ask, connected to that, was Hughes made crazy by the CIA and kept reclusive on purpose by the CIA?
Yeah. I mean, yes is the answer to both there. I think we're looking at somebody who has a lot of determination there when he's young. And he's a little older here. And I think that he does become an unusual figure. And I think that he's largely interfered with because of his wealth and position. But I think he is targeted very young, because if you look at who helped him early on and you go into that story, we didn't really have time for that here because we were getting to his relationship to the X and the UFO file. It is unusual because they become kind of like, it's like a nanny state thing where they he's 19 and they kind of take over for him. And I think that by the time the CIA gets their claws into him, they've figured out his weaknesses, and they use the Hughes organization and the Hughes empire for all kinds of incredibly nefarious covert operations. So, on both counts, I think the answer is definitely yes.
Place Live wants to know, could X be a representative of a ratio between levels of existence rather than a value?
Well, it's possible. And I went into some interesting research around Plato's X. And it's George Latour. And it's very interesting because what we're talking about is some kind of a crossroads that takes place. And they reference the X in all of these different things, going back into ancient history and into the mystery schools. And it always seems to have this effect about, when they're talking in the early days about Atlantis, they say when men were gods. So there's something about the X which is like our full potential. It's like a realization of our full potential all at once. And that it takes a lot you have to kind of grow into that level of being able to absorb that and use it. So if you have it and you're not well developed, I'll use the Fitz thing, which is like giving a caveman a laser gun. It's a very dangerous set of circumstances. But going right to your question, I think it's possible. What you're saying is that it relates kind of to the way I would look at the X is it relates to something that is we're trying to refer to something which is very difficult to communicate without giving away what it is. So they're kind of sort of tracking it, just like, someone would say with something like the UFO file now, where you're talking about an ET experience, that means there are off-world civilizations from another civilization. They came here, they have a craft, they're advanced, and they want to, bring us wisdom or bring us war, whatever it is. It's too simple a formula. In fact, the X Steganography suggests that we've been holding this X through different brotherhoods and mystery schools for ages. So I think that it's possible when we get around the UFO file, because we're dealing with the X Steganography there, that they're working off of this old secret society tradition of using an X to delineate what they're portraying there, what they're referencing. So, but yeah, I think that gets pretty close to it.
Okay, Indiana Jones, DJ and Catfit, as we call her, believe Trump have control over the Pentagon, or do they control Trump? Lockheed Martin.
Oh, well, I think we're in the middle of the battle of that. And I think originally they just tried to kind of reject him outright and just, get him off the table. But he proved more tenacious, and his support did also. It was an incredibly weak hand trying to use the Russian collusion aspect. Very sneaky tactics, and those didn't work out so well, although that's still in process. The Lockheed aspect, I think that they are clever enough to manipulate his love of the military. I mean, he did give them a hard time over Air Force One and spending too much money to develop a new version of that. So I think we've seen some pushback there, and I think that it's an ongoing situation. You know, it's one of these things where we have to look at it and see where Trump sits, because I think that they're all about war. That's where they make their profits. They want to bomb Iran. They want to bomb Syria. That's what Lockheed's all about. And I think that it's possible somebody like Trump is saying, look, we can make lots of money in space, you know, which is where you guys are moving towards anyway. So they're looking at him like, do we have to share our information with him? But I don't think it's any one president that has enough power to deal with them. So it's a tricky balance right now. Okay, we'll take two more.
Okay, thought pattern 0, is Elon Musk the new Howard Hughes?
Wow, that's a great question, a great realization, and a great catch by you, Olivia. I think it makes a very good case, because here's somebody who's very innovative. Here's somebody who's very much on the cutting edge, and somebody who, by the very nature of what he does, has to play ball. Because if you're going to go into space, then you have to deal with, you know, all those controls that we have here. So I think Musk is, I think the stuff that he's developing, that we're on the cusp of something very exciting coming out of the work that he's doing. And unfortunately, I think that whenever you're dealing with large-scale development, we are dealing with these military contractors and the deep state controlling a lot of what happens there. So, but yeah, I think he makes a good candidate for it. Okay, we'll take whatever you find over there. Let's take the last question. Or if you got two questions.
Well, I've got these intensely long questions. But James Clements,
yes.
Clements, just each one is very juicy, and I don't know which one to give you. So I'll start with this one. DJ, do you believe advanced beings beyond our world will ever allow this great evil, a dark Luciferian Brave New World / Star Trek Borg AI transhuman SSP to further threaten peace in this galaxy?
Oh, it's an interesting way to put it. Well, I'd say this. Look, you know, let's take a look at Henry Olcott and Annie Besant, okay? Here's Olcott and Besant driving the Theosophical Society towards Indian home rule. Now, they had to make the effort to prevent those things from happening, like, you know, the British just permanently ruling over India. You know, the effort has to be made, the clash has to commence. So there's no getting around that. I don't think that there is a kind of a magic umbrella out there that is going to prevent the storm. But I will say that I think the more that we exercise our ability to bring awareness to these things, and the more people have the ability to plug into forces that are not warlike and are not against humanity, then we have better choices, and we can make better choices with that. So we can tune in, and we have the ability, we have the resources spiritually to tune in and get a better outcome going. But I don't think anything's guaranteed in that sense. I mean, you have to go forward with a certain amount of confidence when you're dealing with these things, but you have to make the effort. And if you make the right kind of effort, you get the good kind of results. I think that's the way to look at it. But you have to be a little careful, because that nanny state thing of just thinking, well, they're sitting out there and they'll help us if anything goes wrong, you know, it's a little tricky. We have to do a lot ourselves to kind of earn that support. Let's put it that way. But great question, and very poetic. Okay, what else you got?
Well, there was a little discussion about Wilhelm Reich early on, and
wow,
how it may or may not relate to the UFO sightings.
Yeah, well, let's say this about Reich. he was a complex character. He certainly had sides to his character where he allowed his libido to take over his research. And he had a lot of really wild ideas. However, the fact that he was a student of Freud's and that he got into the UFO aspect is important. And the fact that they shut him down and actually burnt his books relating to, different types of energy and relating to his research around UFOs and these things he called cloud busters, which were meant to smoke out UFOs from hanging out in clouds. There's a lot of very unusual things with Reich. But I think whenever you see the establishment burning books and repressing somebody like Sar Barker, for example, then you really know for sure that they're letting something out that's not supposed to come out. So I think it's worthwhile to think about Reich and what was going on there for sure, and especially his work around UFOs. It's very unusual. Okay, it's Europe.
So I got in a little trouble early on in the chat talking about the different generations. And David Tormina said, DJ, it feels strange being a member of Generation X. Why do you think they named it X?
That is very interesting. There's a lot of X quite fascinating things relating to steganography around X, as we've shown. I think there's a way we can track the actual X, and then there are other X's that are there that you wonder if it's related or not. So there is that, and I think some fit and some don't. But I think the whole Generation X thing, they have a traditional explanation for these things when they come out. But I really think it's quite interesting because if you think about it, we're moving into that period when you get to Generation X, when they're able to start to use what was developed in the UFO file. So they're at the very cusp of being able to reveal that. So I think what's particularly fascinating is the era that we're in now. They're doing this kind of tilting exercise of, can we get away with introducing aspects of the UFO file and the secrecy we've kept around it? And can we make you forget about the 70 years of cover-ups around it? It's a dangerous game that they're playing. And that's why I've been so against the CIA being in charge of UFO disclosure. It's a disaster because the CIA is known, especially in those circles, for obfuscation and misinformation and treachery. So no, they're not a good one to be around the UFO file. Okay, what else you got?
Let's end on this one. Erica McLaughlin wants to know, where did you learn your Steiner?
Well, Steiner's one of the studies that I've had pretty much my whole life. So I tell this kind of funny story, which is just generally to give an idea that when I was younger, maybe about 10 years old, I had this thing where I would get out of school at 2 o'clock, and my mom couldn't come by to get me until 6. And she absolutely did not want me hanging out with school kids and things like that. So her big solution to the whole plan was for me to spend time between 2 and 6 when I would see her at the library. And that became an ongoing. So basically, like, the library was kind of my babysitter for a long time. So many things I got to absorb through that unusual process. But that's about as close as I can get to where I found the Steiner stuff. But it's always been there. It's one of those things which I gravitated to. It seems to me that there's a connection between Steiner's work, Gurdjieff's work, Theosophy, and the Casey tradition that is kind of like a golden cord. And that when you get below that, you get differing levels of interesting things. A lot of people have mentioned Alice Bailey when we talk about Theosophy. And, it's interesting, but the truth is the real meat of the action with Theosophy is when you're dealing with Blavatsky and Besant and Ledbetter in that version of the work, I think. So I always go there first. But yeah, great question. Okay, you can do one more.
Erica is not satisfied with that answer.
Okay.
But I think that's about your recall, which is extraordinary, because you have almost a photographic memory. And That's what people envy more than anything.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I love the connections of these ideas. I love the incredible things that were contributed by anthroposophy. And, Steiner's work is always close by with the kind of my thought process. And I think that he contributed greatly. And it's amazing because I think these people have really stood up. And, I mentioned Besant a lot because she didn't just learn a number of things. She actually brought about home rule. She actually preserved Keeley's technology. She actually moved the Theosophical Society. I think this is the important thing. It's that knowledge and application together, right? It's the wisdom of the sages. Putting them together really seems like the key thing. Now, before we go, I will say a shout out to a couple of people.
Oh, actually, do you want to talk about that bird flu?
No, we'll save that for another time. But
Okay.
That is interesting because they have this weird bird flu they're calling X that's coming out of Asia. And it's like, it's a new Asiatic flu. Everybody, run for cover. We just killed 600 Chinese people with it. It's it is quite mysterious when they start using these things. I think it's the X now has been spotted out and we need to learn to look for it. One of the interesting things that Steiner said is we need to learn where to look. And that's what the steganography tells us, because the steganography being different from the cryptology, where the cryptology is a system where we know it's a puzzle and we try to fix it, but steganography is different. So X steganography is what? It is something that's hidden in plain sight that somebody who knows can recognize. That's what steganography is. It's not there so you know it's a puzzle. It's not like the Enigma machine. It's not like a code that you wait and you realize you have to crack it. It's just there in hiding in plain sight. And so that's what we're after here with the X steganography. And wow, it's great. Californology, Line of Judea. There's somebody, a cult fan is out there. It's great to see everybody. Indiana Jones, always good to have Indiana Jones out there. TJ Liberty Bell, it's great to have you. It's great to have you with us. And Ice Angel, fantastic. Really appreciate Indiana Joe. Excellent. Always excellent comments and questions. We really appreciate it. We will be back next week. And we have a very special guest. Remember, mark a calendar, Friday, 7 p.m. And Friday's the 22nd. That's going to be a sensational show. And it's been really terrific having you, all of you tonight. And I will leave you with this in terms of what we've discovered about the X, really in relation to Howard Hughes, which is that the real key, in my opinion, is Van Tassel working in concert with Hughes and Maheu working in concert with Bannister. When we figure those two things out, and we put them together with the Age of Secrets commentary by John Meyer and his revelation about Maheu being behind the RFK assassination, we go a giant step forward in understanding what it is that we're looking at. I will see you next week. And Olivia, what can I say? Excellent, incredible, and everyone out there is getting the incredible benefit of working with Olivia and seeing what I've seen for so long, which is, wow, she's just incredible. And every little thing she does is magic, right? So the only thing left to decide is what's on for tonight.
It's my fish food is waiting in the freezer.
Fish food calleth, as they say. Thank you, everyone, and we will see you next week.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
That was, yes.